I watched the Eddie Hearn interview on IFL TV where Kugan Cassius interviews Eddie Hearn ahead of the prizefighter lightweights bill, which was on Sky last Saturday. The interview, I think it was about 12 minutes long, substantially focused on conversations relating to Chris Eubank Jr, both regarding his team and his career, as well as the recent fight with Billy Joe Saunders. Now, first thing that was evident is that Eddie Hearn clearly had received a copy of the contractual documents. He showed Kugan Cassius an email reportedly from Chris Eubank Sr, which asked for Eddie Hearn's advice and included all the terms and conditions, including salaries for the fight. Now, IFL TV, Kugan Cassius play quite a difficult role. Clearly, Kugan is quite good friends with Eddie Hearn, but he's also an employee now of Box Nation, and for his sake needs to maintain good relations with Frank Warren. As such, he's typically very, very neutral, if you don't watch all of his interviews, refuses to take sides, refuses to say which Billy thinks best, which fighter will win in a fight, etc. But Kugan Cassius did effectively confirm, upon being showed Eddie Hearn's phone and an email, that Eddie Hearn did in fact have an email from Chris Eubank Sr, and that Eddie Hearn had received the purse information for the fight. Not just that fight, but also the Omar Ciala fight, which took place on the Return of the Magnificent Seven bill with Chris Eubank 4 weeks previously. Now, this is interesting. On the face of it, it's a relatively shrewd move from Chris Eubank Sr. His fighter, Chris Eubank Jr, effectively is a promotional free agent. He's not signed to Frank Warren, he's not signed to Queensberry Promotions. So, on the face of it, he's asking somebody, Eddie Hearn, what he thinks of the contract, what he thinks of the T's and C's, what he thinks of the purses. Eddie Hearn obviously would be extremely knowledgeable on that subject, given his role. And he's doing a reasonably decent job as the manager of a fighter, making sure he's getting advice from people in the know, making sure he gets the best deal for his fighter. I think on the sinister side, what has actually happened here is that Chris Eubank Sr is aware of the let's just say Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn are probably not on each other's Christmas cards list. I think Chris Eubank Sr is probably aware of that. And I think Chris Eubank Sr was perhaps annoyed at how Frank Warren repeatedly called him out in public and vilified him for his behaviour. And I must say, I agree with Frank Warren on the comments he made regarding Chris Eubank Sr and not turning up to press conferences, wanting a deposit in an escrow account, etc, etc. And I think Chris Eubank Sr, whilst on the face of it he's simply shopping around for the best deal for his son and making sure his son isn't being screwed over, my guess is what he's actually done is made a tactical move in order to extract revenge on Frank Warren. He's been annoyed at Frank Warren calling his name out in public. So what he's done is made the details of the agreement open to Eddie Hearn, because he knew Eddie Hearn would publicly tear into Frank Warren. Now, a few comments that Eddie Hearn made that I want to pick up on. On numerous occasions before the fight, Billy Joe Saunders made reference to the fact that Chris Eubank Jr would be the recipient of a 6-figure payday. Perhaps an interesting comment. I read that Tyson Fury and Derek Chisora were each expected to receive a 7-figure payday, around, this is very much unsubstantiated, around a £2 million mark. Now, effectively on the night, Eubank Saunders was the main event. That's the fight fans were most interested in seeing. They were the two unbeaten fighters. It wasn't like Fury Chisora, they'd already had a one-sided fight before. It was certainly the best fight out of the two. Probably had the most hype around it, the most public interest. So, when Billy Joe says Eubank's getting a 6-figure payout, obviously 6 figures is very broad. Technically, Eubank could have got 900 grand or 999 grand. But you kind of get the impression it would be closer to the 100s, because if he was getting, say, $250,000, you'd think Billy Joe would have said that rather than 6 figures. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. But if Fury and Chisora did get 2 million each, which is a big if, perhaps there is some question as to Chris Eubank Jr.'s purse. Eddie Hearn repeatedly asserted that it was a very, very low purse. What I would say is that Chris Eubank Jr., with the level of opposition he'd been in with, it's hard to say that he would have earned anything more than a 5-figure purse before this. He certainly wouldn't have touched a 6-figure purse before in his career, because you just don't get those for fighting the likes of Ty and Booth and Bradley Price. I know Eubank Jr.'s got a big following, and he's, one of the boxers who gets on TV, on Channel 5, etc. But I'd be very surprised if he's got anywhere near a 6-figure purse for a televised fight before. So I'm sure it's a step in the right direction. But nonetheless, interesting that Eddie Hearn sort of seemed to think Chris Eubank Jr. was the recipient of very low purses. Perhaps that was to kind of pour scorn on Frank Warren, his big rival, or perhaps it was an effort to try and attract Chris Eubank Jr. to the matchroom and the Sky side of things. Obviously, the Eubanks will be aware of the sort of purses that fighters like Cleverly, fighters like Bellew, George Groves have received while fighting on matchroom pay-per-views, and maybe they'll be attracted to some of that matchroom money for future, because we must remember that Chris Eubank Jr. is of course a promotional free agent. Eddie Hearn also made sort of several references to the fact that the Eubanks had come to him for his advice. I mean, the Eubanks have done a lot of business with Mick Hennessy. They've now done a lot of business with Frank Warren. Is this Eddie Hearn just wanting to be seen as the go-to guy? Or is it something deeper than that? Is it kind of an assertion that, you couldn't trust the Frank Warren contract, you couldn't trust the Frank Warren documents? I think Eddie Hearn's final comment, which I thought was a slightly unfair one, as he described it as a lose-lose. No, he didn't say that actually. The quote was, "It's a no-win situation for Chris Eubank Jr. this fight." I guess what he meant when he said it's a no-win situation, and this is just my sort of interpretation, is that Billy Joe isn't, he's a good fighter, he's known amongst the sort of boxing hardcore. He possibly wouldn't be known by the general public. Maybe he'd even be lesser known than Chris Eubank Jr. Now, I guess what Eddie Hearn's saying is, if Chris Eubank lost to Billy Joe Saunders, which he did end up doing, he loses his zero, he loses his unbeaten record against a fighter who isn't hugely well known, isn't a world champion, and also, it's a tough fight, I guess. It's a tough fight on a platform in Box Nation that doesn't have the same viewing figures perhaps as Sky or, Channel 5. It's a fight that, Billy Joe was initially the favourite in, even though he's not the most well-known fighter. And I guess Eddie Hearn was trying to suggest that it was poor matchmaking for Eubank Jr. to even be in that fight. He's certainly done that before with Cleverly and Sergei Kovalev, which perhaps is a more fair comparison. But I think what Eddie Hearn perhaps neglects is that Eubank Jr. was I think he'd had 17 or 18 fights, but he'd never fought anyone even bordering respectability in the middleweight division. I mean, realistically, it would be a stretch to say that on form Eubank was even a top 10 middleweight in Britain before that fight. Yet, he's had the opportunity to fight for the British, the Commonwealth and the European, which is an opportunity that doesn't arise for a lot of fighters unless they're sort of the golden child of a promoter with a lot of money, or unless they've really worked their way up. As it happens, I don't think having a 0 needs to be the be-all and end-all in boxing. I think that Eubank performed with credit, and whilst there is sort of huge gaps for improvement, I think this fight has only raised his profile, and it's only raised, in my opinion, he did better than I thought he was going to do. He showed a lot of attributes, a lot of skills, a lot of heart. It's possibly raised. It has definitely raised him in my estimations. So I disagree with Hearn that it was a no-win situation, because he had the opportunity to win the European, the British, the Commonwealth against the promoter's home fighter at a time when typically a fighter with Eubank's record wouldn't get the opportunity to fight for those belts. He also got what must have been a massive career high payday. I imagine it was treble, quadruple what he'd earned in the past. That's just my guess. But interesting comments about, the purse being terrible, because Billy Joe Saunders seemed to think it was a very, very respectable purse. And I'm wondering if anyone's got any information or anyone's got any ideas as to how the purses may vary between a Sky fighter and a Box Nation fighter. Is there a huge swing? Will guys like Nathan Cleverley, names don't spring to mind, but all the guys who've jumped from Frank Warren to Eddie Hearn, will those guys all be getting absolutely massive money comparatively because of the Sky deal? I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this one, and I'm interested to hear what was Eddie Hearn's game plan here. It seemed slightly out of character for him. He's normally quite chilled out. He's normally quite sort of affable, likeable, but he really went on the attack here. He looked like he was annoyed. He did something that I've seen Frank Warren do before, and sow emails and pull out emails. What was his game plan? Was it just to discredit the opposition? Was it a tactic to tell the Box Nation fighters, you're not getting enough money, come and talk to me? Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.